Hello and welcome to another episode of the Breachside Broadcast, home of the finest voxcasting either side of the breach. On today's episode, we reach the end of Malifaux Burns. It has been a tale that has set Malifaux aflame, saving some lives, taking others. But one thing is certain, nothing in Malifaux will ever be the same. I hope you enjoy the conclusion of Malifaux Burns, right after this word from our sponsor.
This episode of the Breachside Broadcast is brought to you by Ulix's Hog Ranch. Ulix Turner breeds only the finest specimens of pig kind, suitable for riding, eating, or exploding. Ulix's hogs are fed a strict diet of table scraps, swamp grass, grubs, small gremlins, or whatever else they can get their snouts into. Stop by the ranch to see the new litter and pick out a juicy one for yourself.
Spontaneous pork combustion. There was simply no other way to describe what had happened to little Bella. Although those three words were not the ones that came to Ulix Turner's mind as he watched the squealing piglet burst alight and explode in a shower of roasted meat and bubbling fat. "Scratch, Skitter, get over here now," Ulix barked, as he wiped away the piece of snout that had lodged itself in the lip of his moth-bitten cap. "Don't make me come find you." It was approaching the end of a very long day, and Ulix was tired. The sun had begun to set over the bayou, although he could not see its bloody rays. Dark grey clouds were circulating overhead, flush with what he anticipated was a heavy rain. Something felt off, something that the old rancher could not put his finger on. The air was even muggier than normal, thicker than sap, and hot like a still left too long on the boil. Even more unusually, the quartet of crickets, frogs, mosquitoes, and waterfowl that was a constant chorus in the bayou had grown eerily silent. Tonight, the lullaby of chirping, buzzing, honking, and croaking was conspicuous only by its absence. Splattering footsteps heralded the arrival of Scratch and Skitter. The gremlin twins came bursting out from the supply shed, running in panic towards the sound of the blast. The brothers were decent folk. Ulix had offered them a hot meal a few times a week in exchange for some honest work. The old hermit did not much like the companionship of others, but he needed the help, and it had been hard for those two ever since their parents had died a few months back at Stone Hill. Both showed a promising aptitude for calming the pigs, even the rowdier boars, but they were still new to the ranch, and like any novice, they made mistakes. Ulix was careful never to leave them alone for too long beyond his or Penelope's watchful gaze. At the very least, he was determined to make sure that this round of help lasted at least a few weeks longer than the last. Skitter was the first to catch sight of Ulix, standing a few feet away from a smoking crater in the ground and covered in pig parts. The youth almost burst out laughing, but caught himself just in time. Still, he dropped his slop pod, leaving Scratch standing awkwardly, while the gelatinous swill pooled around his skinny green ankles. The pigs began crowding around the edges of their pens, stamping their hooves and snorting with excitement to get at the smouldering slush. "What'd I tell you about stuffing the rat piglets?" Ulix asked sternly, cuffing Skitter around one of his big floppy ears. He would have grabbed Scratch too, were it not for the need to brace himself against his crutch with his other hand. "Little Bella ain't supposed to be stuffed, and the boomstick goes outside, not in." "We didn't do it, boss, we swears," pleaded Scratch, his eyes wide in wonderment. He pointed at the spilled bucket of slop. "Skit and me haven't touched any of 'em since lunch. We was waiting till after feeding time to stuff the special ones for Mr. Wong. We remember, sir, it's only supposed to be 3 piggies, Rasher, Trotters, and Evangeline. You ain't lying me now, are you, boy? Ulix narrowed his gaze suspiciously, letting go of Skitter to pick a piece of scorched meat out of his scraggly beard. This ain't one of your jokes? No, sir, it ain't, replied Scratch. You's been kind to us since Ma and Pa. His ears drooped as he struggled to finish the thought. We likes you, Mr. Turner. Scratch eyed the chunks of charred meat, intestines, and bone fragments scattered on the ground. Anyway, Lil Bella was my favorite of the new litter, he concluded, clearly crestfallen. Look, Skitter interrupted, pointing as ash began to pour down from the sky. The flakes were small at first, like little grains of sand, but within moments they began to drift as heavily and thickly as muffling snow. Is that what them humans call Christmas? He asked excitedly, bouncing on the balls of his feet and raising his hands up to catch the flakes between his little green hands. He tried to taste one with his tongue. Phooey, he spluttered. That don't taste like nothing. Scratch, on the other hand, was wary. He covered his mouth with his hands. Of the 2 brothers, Ulix privately thought that he was the one more likely to reach adulthood. What the hell is going on, boss? He asked, his voice muffled. I don't know, but don't cuss, little 'un, Ulix growled, his mind racing. Something was definitely wrong. The old gremlin felt it in his bones. Somehow he just knew it wasn't safe to be outside. The grey clouds, the thickness in the air, and then Lil Bella. Suddenly, another piglet in one of the adjacent pens began to swell. The others squealed and scattered. One of the swine, either braver or dumber than the others, stayed put. It oinked inquiringly at its bloated companions. It would now become round as a cannonball. Smoke began pouring out of its snout. The curious piglet cocked its head to one side before extending a tiny hoof to prod his rotund friend. Ulix saw what was about to happen before it did. Down, he thundered, tossing aside his crutch and forcing both Skitter and Scratch into the dirt as yet another piglet burst into flames. When he had the courage to look up again, he spat out a mouthful of mud. He was utterly flabbergasted by what he saw. It was a symphony of porcine pandemonium. The great movement began with a bassoon-like thwump, made by at least a dozen more piglets, as they too expanded like balloons. Next came the fwoom of an overblown woodwind, as steam poured from their quivering ears and snouts. Then a cacophony of panicked oinks ran through the evening, high-pitched like strings plucked in a staccato, their vibration accompanied by the booming percussion of frantically stamping hooves. The impromptu tempo swelled, pulsating into a zany crescendo in an inexplicable madness that permeated the ear so loudly that even old Cranky would have been able to hear it. Then, as if an unseen conductor had brought down his wand with a mighty chop, the beat dropped. Amidst the falling ash, an airborne, kaleidoscopic salad of crispy bacon, shattered pig bones, and floppy tents of hogskin rained down upon the farm with an enormous, earth-shattering boom. What's happening? Shrieked Skeeter, face still pressed into the dirt. Is we gonna die? Ulix didn't answer. His hands were still covering the backside of his head. The old gremlin was breathing heavily, trying to get his bearings. Suddenly, he felt a jolt of surprise shoot down his spine as something warm and wet kissed his forehead. He saw that one of the pigs had grown at least 4 times its usual size, though it had not exploded. The massive beast's newfound girth could have given even old Major a run for his money. But that was not all that had changed. Not 1, but 2 sets of massive tusks sprouted from its rubbery lips, and additional horn-like protrusions jutted forth from its neck and the joints of its front legs. Its skin was the color of burnt umber, and the flesh had become semi-translucent, like smoky glass. Ulix could make out roiling flames rippling inside its ribcage and blazing behind its eyes. Although the pig looked utterly demonic, the creature had nuzzled him affectionately with its snout. Ulix picked himself up gingerly from the ground, noticing with relief that no more of his hogs looked like they too were on the verge of combustion. The surrounding pens were a mess of pig parts and splattered mud, kicked up by all the surviving swine huddled fearfully in the corners. "You can't be," Ulix began, shocked by a sudden recognition that caught him as he looked back at the massive pig. From the look in its eyes, he knew. What is that?" muttered Scratch. "How did it survive?" Ash continued to fall. "That boy," answered Ulix, clambering to his feet and hardly daring to believe it, "is a very special friend." It looked so different now that its hide was no longer gleaming gold. "Ooh, friend," said Skidder, excited again now that the threat seemed to have passed. He reached forward to pat the swine on its bristly, smoking head. Almost instantly, the little gremlin issued a yelp of pain and withdrew his hand. It's hot, he screeched, sticking his burned fingers in the nearest puddle and discharging a satisfied sigh of relief. The flaming pig nudged Ulix again. The rancher felt the heat, but it was not painful. Instead, it was comforting, like a stove-lit fire on a cold night. Then, miraculously, the beast sunk onto its hindquarters, butt plopped into the mud. Ulix could not explain how, but he understood what he had to do. "You sure now?" he murmured tenderly, patting it on its heavy haunches. The pig grunted impatiently. Shrugging, Ulix tossed aside his crutch and hoisted himself onto its flaming back. Its hair was soft and silky to the touch, comfortable as an old velvet blanket. As soon as it felt him securely in place, the makeshift steed lumbered to its feet. Ulix gripped his thighs more tightly around its frame, feeling the steel-like tendons of the ropey, magically enhanced musculature beneath. Then, without warning, the pig took off, barreling at full speed and forcing both Skidder and Scratch to dive for cover. Ulix hardly dared to believe it, but he was in control. He was not hanging on for dear life, trying to keep his balance despite the awkward distribution of weight caused by his missing leg. Instead, he relished the feeling of hot wind blowing through his beard, as the pig's already swift pace escalated to an all-out dash. The hog ran at a steady tempo, its trotters spraying up great clumps of dirt and moss with each heavy, purposeful step. "Hi-ya!" Ulix shouted gleefully, digging his bony knees deeper into the pig's side. It complied and darted forward even faster, pelting through the falling ash. He had already cleared the little paddock of Ulix's farm. Now the mount was carrying him aloft through the swamp, streaking like a bullet over the very paths that Ulix himself had only been able to hobble through with agonizing effort. The massive swine barreled across broken logs, muddy pools, and mossy stones, goring its way clean through thickets of mouldering foliage and rotting bark. Splinters and pebbles flew in its wake like little shards of shrapnel. "Let's see Burton Gracie do this." He was almost as swift as his mount, ducking low-hanging branches and instinctually shifting his weight to compensate for every swerve. Riding felt natural, as though the pig were an extension of his own body. The hog brought him more swiftness and mobility than he ever could have imagined, even before he had lost his leg. The bayou was a dangerous place, full of skeeters, gators, silurids, and worse. But now he was a predator, swift and agile. He did not know how long he had been gone, or how far they had tread. Had it been minutes? Hours? He was past caring. Time seemed inconsequential, as the raw, boundless joy filled his creaky old bones like the chorus of a long-forgotten song. He hoped never to let it go. At last, Ulix's heart began to sink as he caught sight of the old apple tree marking the boundary of his ranch. The tree grew steadily in the distance with every second of his approach, signaling that the joyride was coming to its inevitable end. Still, one last stroke of inspiration struck Ulix. It was the desire to show off, like he was one of Ophelia Lacroix's untamable young'uns. Egged on by his own boldness, Ulix let go of the hog and reached for the old bow at his back. With surprising vigor, he nocked an arrow, drew back the string, and took aim at a lonely apple hanging from one of the tree's highest branches. He loosed at precisely the right moment, skewering the apple clean through its core. It flew 10 feet and landed before Scratch's toenails, arrow quivering, pointing down in the dirt. "Y'all seeing this shit?" Ulix yeehawed, tipping his hat with glee as his new companion barreled to a halt. The bucking force of the pig's great smoldering hide launched Ulix forward like a cannonball, and he fell face first into the mud. The old rancher laughed despite himself, feeling the drops of filthy water drip down from his scraggly beard. He struggled to right himself, unable to balance on only one leg. "Didn't you say no cussin', Mr. Turner?" asked Skidder with a devilish grin, handing him his crutch. "Damn straight, son," he chuckled, ruffling the little gremlin across the ears. "That I did." He reached down, plucking the apple from the sod as if it were a precious gemstone. The two brothers were dumbstruck, and Ulix couldn't help but feel an enormous sense of satisfaction at the awed look on their puerile faces. He tossed the apple over to his blazing mount, who devoured it in a single raucous chomp. "This don't make no sense, boss," ventured Scratch, stroking his chin and careful not to get too close to the massive flaming hog. He took a step back as the great beast raked the dirt with its molten hooves. Evidently it enjoyed the hiss of evaporating mud accompanying each stroke. "How'd he survive? And how come you can touch him but we can't?" "It don't have to make no sense, boy," answered Ulix, looking up at the ash falling from the sky with a raised eyebrow. "I don't know why this is happening, or whose idea this was for old Ulix. But see here, little uns, I'm gonna roll with it," he decided staunchly as he puffed out his chest. "And so should you." As the ash continued to fall, the old rancher took a moment to savor his newly restored pride as he felt the first genuine smile split his grizzled, curmudgeonly features in a long, long time. "Now, boys," Ulix scolded, gesturing at the pig offal scattered all around them, like gory, stinking confetti. "Who's going to help me clean up this here mess?" Reva had spent the last few weeks at the edge of the cistern, and today was no different. Her stomach sunk as she noticed that the toxic moss had crept a couple feet higher. Although the bottom of the well was a long way down, the plant's creeping tendrils would surely reach the top within the span of a few days. Reva had already sent out several patrols into the adjacent sewer tunnels, guided by the lampad spirit she'd summoned to light the way. Some went to other sources of water to supplement the cistern's polluted depths. The herbalists and academic types went out in search of evidence of the moss elsewhere in the damp, labyrinthine passages, as well as something they could use to destroy it. But none had met with much success. Patrols had to keep traveling farther away to gather water, and few made it back without some sort of injury or mishap. Even stranger was the conclusion that the parasitic algae did not seem to grow anywhere else. Meanwhile, brave Alexandra had successfully managed to safely trap a small sample, although she'd nearly lost a finger in the process. The stuff was carnivorous. She'd worn a thick winter glove while she scooped it from one of the buckets. Still, the young woman was forced to retract her hand the instant she found the plant contracting around her index finger like a boa constrictor. She abandoned the leather and sealed it into a thick glass jar, along with the moss and the muddy water, watching with perverse fascination as it devoured the hide. Over the next few minutes, the fibers of tanned calf skin disintegrated as if they were being dissolved in acid. There was nothing left but the moss swimming in its own swill. Alexandra shook the jar and watched, both disgusted and intrigued, as the clumps of algae flipped upside down, exposing an underside with hundreds of tiny, sharp, thorn-like teeth. Jeremiah had proposed early on that they attempt to boil the water. Reva agreed. She lit a pyre and placed the jar above it, suspended from a makeshift spit by a rusted chain. The water bubbled and turned temporarily clear, but the moss was resistant. Just as the muck, slime, and other detritus had finished floating to the top, leaving the bottom part transparent, the moss convulsed as if suffering from a palsy. Like a sponge excreting dirty fluid, it regurgitated a fresh wave of sticky brown slime that began to disperse throughout the container. Seconds later, the water jar was more opaque than ever, and it did not become clear again, despite several more minutes of exposure to Reva's enchanted flames. Every other experiment the group had tried met with failure. The latest attempt, an acidic mixture they concocted, looked to be effective at stemming the moss's growth, but did nothing to purge the water of its filth. Jeremiah started looking over his notes, while two others, Quinn and Davis, checked their remaining supplies, quickly lamenting how little they had left. Their chatter rang hollow in Reva's ears. She was tired. Without a word, she stood and left for her tent, utterly defeated. She needed to lie down. If her caravan had to move again, she would need to persuade them. She had slept poorly the night before. A nap would clear her head. The instant she collapsed onto her cot, the darkness overtook her once again. But this time, there was no voice. Its absence was more unsettling than Reva anticipated. "Is there anyone there?" was what she wanted to shout. But as it had always been with this dream, she was being suffocated. She mouthed the words, attempting to speak them with all of her might, but no sound came out. She still could not see in front of her. The oozing blackness was thick and predatory, just like the moss. Then, something. She felt it on the back of her neck. There was no breath stinking of mulch and decay, like a rotten carcass half dissolved in its own bile. No. This was a heat, a cleansing presence. Reva Cortinas. She felt the darkness writhe around her again, convulsing in time with the voice. It was weaker than it had ever been. Then something new. The blighted caress tried to creep its way under her skin, as though afraid of the light that had invaded Reva's dream. The feelings of vulnerability, of powerlessness, of cosmic insignificance fell away like ghostly shackles. She was Reva Cortinas, leader of the lost, the flame in the darkness, the spectral rider. That anything could ever make her feel so helpless, just like when her superstitious parents had strapped her down in her childhood bed, was more torture than physical pain. She would not submit. Even as the darkness seemed to chew away at the essence of her soul, she would withstand the punishment for as long as the dream lasted. She had kept this grave presence with her since childhood. It had tried to make her give up, but now it needed her to protect itself from what was coming. Reva was in control. There was no reason to be afraid, because there was light. It burst before her eyes with an arcane radiance that was beyond description. Reva could not turn away, although even if she could have, she would not have wanted to. The scorching apparition was beautiful. It pulsed with so many colors, amber, marigold, claret, each flickering, seared shade more spectacular than the last. It took Reva's racing mind a moment to realize that she was staring at a flame. It materialized before her, and fought back the darkness, effacing more and more of the inky black fog. As the darkness retracted, Reva's senses returned. Under the illumination of the flame, there now was an up, a down, a left, a right. She could place the conflagration hovering 10 feet directly in front of her, arcing its stunning light in a full circle. She beheld more than flames. It was a man, a burning man, his arms splayed and outstretched at his sides, as if in a gesture of welcome. The godhead simply floated in the nothingness before her, casting forth its heat, its warmth, and its luminosity, bathing her in a warm cascade. At last, for the first time in months, Reva dreamt that she could see a path cut through the endless dark. There was a way, revealed in fire. No longer inhibited by the darkness, she stepped forward tentatively, like an infant taking its first steps. It was as if her dream self had been deprived of mobility for so long that it no longer remembered the motions. "Who are you?" she asked in awe, gazing up at the swirling inferno of the man's featureless face. He said nothing to her. He did not even move. Suddenly, a guttural hiss rang through the remaining gloom. "She is mine." The voice returned, clinging to the dissipating edges of the darkness retreating from the flames, filling over itself like the charred edges of a burning letter. Yet the inky black fog attempted to re-solidify. It coalesced itself into a great wave that towered high above her, threatening to crash down with the power of a tsunami. In that moment, Reva felt something heavy in her left hand. She looked down and saw a lantern made from polished jet-black steel. It had no glass casing, oil well or wick, just a ball of bright flames that roiled with the same collage of hues as her fiery savior. Instinctively, she knew what she had to do. "I deny you," Reva bellowed, shocked by the sound of her own voice as she raised the lantern high. The wave of darkness broke around her. She heard a terrible shriek and smelled something burning. It took her a moment to place the scent as the smell of scorched mildew. The luminary awoke from her revelation with a start. Reva's tent was just as she'd left it before her slumber, but she was sitting bolt upright atop her cot. The lantern remained in her hand. Careful not to scorch the overhanging canvas, she rose and swiftly opened the flap. "Feeling better?" Vincent greeted her from the other side. "You've been out for several hours. It's nearly 6. He caught sight of the lantern. "What is that?" But she silenced him with a look, and instead approached the cistern with purposeful strides, as if in a trance. The moss had climbed ever higher during her respite. Even more troublingly, the patch of sky revealed by the oculus had turned dark. Embers and flakes of ash were drifting down from the heavens. "What's going on?" asked Jeremiah, pointing upwards in wonderment. Reva simply motioned him out of the way as she reached the edge of the pit. Mouthing wordlessly, she extended her lantern over the edge. The flame in the center grew agitated, shifting from left to right with the graphitic force of liquid swirling back and forth in a rocking washtub. Then a small wad of flame burst from the lantern. An instant later, a massive inferno erupted from the bottom of the well, illuminating the entirety of the cistern chamber in a dazzling glow. Tongues of white-hot flame leapt skyward, stretching up several dozen feet toward the oculus, as if reaching for the clouds. A terrible scream that only she could hear reverberated around her. The inhabitants of Reva's camp covered their eyes and looked downward at the stone floor. Her horse whinnied and reared onto its hind legs. Children cried. Even Vincent St. Clair, for all of his fortitude, could not bear the terrible beauty of the raging firestorm. Against the harsh illumination, Reva stood tall at the edge of the pit, the mysterious lantern still held high. The brightness was so intense that her coal-black cassock seemed to glow yellow, orange, and brown, like the embers falling thickly from the sky. A great pillar of steam vented from the cistern, and out through the oculus above. Its roaring hiss accompanied the firestorm engulfing the tunnels, becoming excruciatingly hot as beads of condensation ran off every surface. After a few moments, the great flame shrunk and flickered out, returning the cistern to its usual darkness. The humidity lingered, as did the sound of water dripping onto the stone floor. Vincent was the first to recover. He dashed to the edge of the pit and looked downward. There was no more fire there, or moss clinging to its sides. The water, too, had vanished. "It's all gone. How did you do that?" he asked, as the rest of Reva's caravan huddled around her, still trying to process what they'd just seen. "I didn't," said Reva faintly, looking up at the oculus through which the godhead from her dream now beheld all of them. "He did." She lifted the lantern again and addressed her flock. "This place has been our home, but it is not our destination. We deserve more than hiding from those who would find fault with our way of life. It is time to return to the light." Vincent's eye glowed green. "Where should we go, Reva? If not here, then where?" Reva smiled, entranced by the flames sputtering in her lantern. "Do not worry. The fire will guide us. The path is bright and beautiful. He will show us the way." Perched on the rooftop of an abandoned warehouse about half a mile from the Guild Enclave, Lucius Mattheson hummed in satisfaction as he traced the smoke billowing from the ruins of the governor's mansion with the tip of his favorite cane. "Well, look who's back," the secretary smirked, shaking his head in amusement. Lucius let his own voice trail away into the night. Now that the sun had set in full, he could better make out the dancing flames below. The entire city was bathed in an eerie red glow, as yet more fire and ash fell from the choked skies. The horizon beyond downtown resembled little more than a piece of parchment curling in a raging hearth. Lapping tongues had not yet reached the city, but it was only a matter of time. Lucius could make out the little silhouettes of scattering citizens, fleeing like ants trying to outscuttle a flood. The panic was indescribably delicious. Words raced through his mind as he tried to properly articulate all of what he saw. An ancient city burns, engulfed in hungering flames. Smoke and ash clog the streets. Hazy shapes scatter and scream, trying to outrun a towering inferno. Flames dance, smoke billows, and embers drip from toxic skies, blanketing everyone below in a burning shadow. There is no hope, no escape. And above it all, a man burns. It is so bright. But these paltry descriptors could hardly do justice to the sheer enormity of such a glorious cleansing. For the first time in centuries, the filthy humans were being properly punished, flushed out from their burrows like rats. Ironically, Lucius thought of the words of an ancient human historian, whom even he had to concede was a writer of prodigious skill. "Sequitur clades, forte and dolo principis incernam trunque octoris prodidere," Lucius recited from perfect memory. "Sed omnibus, que huic urbi per violentium ignium asserunt, gravior atque atrocior." He turned to the gangly figure next to him. "Has a nice ring, doesn't it? Human writing is so primitive, but occasionally I find it suitably descriptive." Lucius' companion, an unnaturally tall and slender man garbed in silver-grey robes crisscrossed with dark leather straps, said nothing. He simply maintained his silent vigil, still as a stone behind his metal mask. "Tacitus, on the great fire of Rome, my dear agent. Annales, Book 15, Chapter 38. Have you read it?" "Of course not." Lucius sighed impatiently, drumming his fingers against the haft of his cane. The bodyguard did not respond. He had heard footsteps from below. The mimic moved unnaturally, stretching and elongating his physical form so as to materialize right in front of the door to the rooftop in the blink of an eye. The instant it opened, he struck like a viper, grabbing the entrant from behind in a chokehold with one hand, while holding a serrated blade to her throat with the other. "Let me go," wheezed Gracina Yao. "That won't be necessary," said Lucius dispassionately, his back still turned. "I was expecting her." With a nod, his agent complied, and the Governor-General's aide dropped to the rooftop, coughing and wiping a trickle of blood from her neck. Her skin began to reseal itself, and the bleeding stopped. Of course, the real Gracina Yao had died months ago. Lucius had seen to her replacement personally. "Apologies," said Lucius, although he was not sorry at all. "I forgot to tell him that I'll be entertaining company. I'm glad you got my signal." She bit back her retort. She knew that the secretary had simply wanted to see her squirm. "What news?" pressed Lucius, his voice suddenly urgent and no longer amused. "Is the Governor-General alive?" "Yes," said Gracina, her throat still hoarse. "Marlowe lives. He and his most loyal staff were in the Crown Room, not his office. I don't know about the rest in the other wings. I didn't see Treasurer Monastas or Abites Julian among the survivors, but they may still live too." "What a shame," Lucius said, composing himself again and straightening the braided cuffs on his jacket. "It would have been convenient if half of them just disappeared." He snapped his fingers with a dark chuckle. "But that wouldn't make for a very exciting story now, would it?" Gracina looked up at the sky, her expression apprehensive. Did you know? Did you do this?" Lucius crossed his velvet-covered arms. "Heavens, no. I didn't. Not every story can be about me," he said without a trace of sarcasm. "Nevertheless, their misfortune is our opportunity," he said. Gracina nodded. "The guild will be distracted for months. We may have gained time, but our people will suffer too." She gestured at the burning city. "Who knows how far this madness will spread? It could reach as far as the wildlands for all you know." "Perhaps, but not for long. Titania will make her move, if she's not already. Zoraida will find me, though I know not of Nikima or Pandora. Neither plays well with others," Lucius scoffed. "But no matter. Human loss is every Neverborn's gain." "What else do you want to know?" Gracina asked with a hesitant bow. "Marlowe's survival means we will have to be patient," said Lucius icily. "It was foolish to have hoped for more. There is nothing more to do until we determine his next steps. You will have to return to them." "Then I take it we'd have no more to discuss," she concluded curtly. Lucius gave a single nod of his golden mask, and the spy murmured her assent as she made to leave. Her steps had grown more confident, almost like a swagger. Lucius hated that. "One more thing," the secretary added, holding up a hand as Gracina turned back to face him. "Tell me, Melindra, I get the sense that you enjoy your new form a little too much. Why is it so pleasing? Frankly, it's hideous. Just like the name Gracina. Neither suits you well at all, my dear. Try as you might to play the role well." In the light of the flickering flames, Gracina's flesh bubbled away, and the beautiful woman with the long black hair and steely grey eyes suddenly transformed into something horrifyingly, unrecognizably different. "Why don't you take off your mask, secretary?" she spat back with as much venom as she could muster. "The Governor-General prefers this form, as do many of the men in his inner circle. They even suspect that some of the women do too," the mimic said with a smile. "It's nice to be liked, you know," she added, almost conversationally. "But you couldn't possibly know how that feels. I mean, if they only just trusted you, you wouldn't need me in the Crown Room now, would you?" The jibe stung, but Lucius ignored it. "Go then, before you are missed," he commanded, shooing her away with a silk-gloved hand. "And do report back soon. I want to know how Marlowe plans to clean up this latest mess. Every little detail." He tapped the ground with his cane between each word. "Your life depends on it." As the mimic departed, Lucius took another satisfied look at Malifaux City's burning streets. At last, there emerged a rather large crack in Marlowe's perfect machine that he could exploit. And it had all been by sheer accident. The whimsy of it all filled Lucius with savage joy. The flames were approaching quickly. It was time to take his leave as well. Drinking in the heat, the sparks, and above all the screams, Lucius Gustavius Fitzwilliam Mattheson beckoned to his bodyguard, straightened his wig, and made for the rooftop door. Despite his bitter disappointment at Marlowe's survival, he still had to suppress the urge to waltz across the threshold. In the ornately decorated hidden chamber beneath the Society Manor, where she kept her most prized possessions from plebeian eyes, Gretchen Janus drummed her fingers against a small glass case. Inside sat a thin desk of dark teal metal, spotted with age and circumscribed with wicked flanges. That these extensions were clearly meant to be functional, like the teeth of a gear, did not detract from the obvious beauty of their artistry and the sharpness of their bite. Upon each projection, the craftsmen had inscribed a series of complex runes that seemed to morph and change wherever they encountered the eye. That was what Gretchen loved most about the tyrants. They understood that even the most common and functional of objects were still worthy of immense beauty. They took no shortcuts like slovenly humans, especially the bric-a-brac of the working class. The moment fire had begun to rain down from the heavens, Lady Janus ordered all of her servants not to seek shelter. Instead, assisted by the Society's neophyte recruits, they were to combat any flames that might penetrate the barrier of protective magic around the building. While everyone else raced to secure windows, doors, and hallways, instinct compelled Gretchen to check on her prized collection. She knew she was right to return the moment she arrived downstairs. Her treasured disc was glowing and vibrating more brightly than she had ever seen. The innermost segment had separated itself from the rest of the artifact, and it began to spin in tandem with the outer rings, but in the reverse direction. Green light seeped furiously from the etched symbols. Gretchen grabbed both sides of the case with a firm but tender grip. Of course, such a move was unnecessary. The artifact was magically suspended by a cushioning spell. Even so, she could not help herself. It was simply too precious, more valuable than the other priceless finds she'd spent a fortune paying Lucas McCabe and Jesse Halliday to acquire. "I know you're there," Gretchen suddenly announced to the gloom. "What is it? Can this not wait?" A voice crawled from the darkness. "We must go away," it sputtered urgently. "We are burning, and her presence still calls us. It is too much." It was like a hoarse whisper, but each word was interspersed with a click, the sound of two moist mandibles colliding as they clenched and unclenched in rapid succession. Gretchen looked up, her hook nose and gaunt features illuminated by the eerie green glow. The only other being who could comprehend the disc's importance had materialized behind her, although not in the manner to which they were accustomed. They did not use a host today. Their elongated body was a mass of clicking, spidery limbs, a bulbous thorax drawn out into a parody of a humanoid form. It culminated in a face that could be mistaken for human, but for the 3 pairs of wet eyes the color of midnight inkstone. "What exactly are you trying to tell me, dear?" asked Gretchen, momentarily diverting her gaze away from the glass case. Eyes narrowed. "We are in pain. We burn. All of us," they said, their insectoid legs twitching agitatedly, as if spinning an invisible thread of silk. "We do not like the light. It burns." For several seconds their head jerked left and right, and then up and down, as if tracking something that Gretchen could not see. It lingered at each position for no longer than a second. "We stare into the light. We see. It hurts, but we cannot stop. It burns," they repeated. They raised their front legs to shield their eyes. although the chamber was dark but for the lime-coloured glow of the spinning disc. "What is different now?" Gretchen probed, now stepping away from the glass, her fullest attention fixated on the spider-like being. "The light burns us," answered the hive mind, the limbs of their body now quivering in unmistakable terror. "Her call is safe. Her forest is dark. It takes away the pain." "I need you to stay. Do not return to her." Gretchen looked up, as another ominous creak escaped from the frescoed ceiling. Little particles of dust fell with each rumble. Nexus' limbs spasmed, and they let out an unintelligible wail that sounded like dozens of voices screaming out at once. Gretchen swore. Her mind raced, trying to find a solution to this new problem. Without a spy master, every plan she'd spent years carefully cultivating would soon unravel. Gretchen's eyes darted across the relics, but nothing the Society collected seemed to offer the fix she needed, and needed now. Until she saw the key to the red cage. A ruby shimmered among the jeweled gears, but her focus was on the vacant section where a serpentine ring should have been. "Division," Gretchen said. "Can you divide yourself? This core to weaken the strength of her call and resist it." A long moment passed as Nexus considered the proposition. "We like this world," they said, their mandibles clicking even faster. "Probing, learning, watching. You have granted us this great gift. She tried to take it away once. She will do so again." It took Gretchen a moment to realize that Hivemind was expressing rage, not excitement. "We will never be free so long as she is returned. She believes we are a mistake. She will want to cleanse us." "Do you think you can do it?" Gretchen demanded. "She is strong," they replied doubtfully. "It is uncertain, but we must try. We need new hosts." "Perhaps I can help then. Stay here." Gretchen hurried towards the stairs, swearing violently under her breath. It was time to call in some unpleasant favors. As night unfolds over Malifaux, the burning man drifts inexorably forward, tugged by an invisible skein that slowly drags him toward the smoldering city. He cannot comprehend that as he glides, fiery embers douse the world below, incinerating all they touch, while unstable tears in the fabric of reality birth unnatural, wriggling horrors into existence. He cannot understand that he spreads madness and insanity like a disease, driving both humans and the never-born alike to frenzied acts of violence and destruction all across the continent. He cannot appreciate how the warping, twisting change he has inflicted on Malifaux's most talented and dangerous individuals will change their lives forever. He cannot realize that a small group of raving madmen who have infiltrated Malifaux and foretold this very day now meet in secret. Nor can he hear their cries of joy as prophecies of a bright, beautiful new world come one step closer towards fulfillment. He cannot perceive that news of his crossing has shifted the balance of power in the very universe from which he came, and that the great nations now mobilize for a fresh wave of grinding conflict. And yet, amidst the blazing chaos and the raw entropy flowing through his veins, the last dregs of something close to consciousness coalesces into one simple thought. Malifaux Burns.
That's it for another episode of the Breachside Broadcast. Join us next time for more Tales of Malifaux.